Everywhere we turn, life seems to whisper the same promise. If only you had this. If only you reached that, then you would finally be at peace. Desire presents itself as a companion, convincing us that just beyond the next achievement, the next possession, or the next embrace lies the end of restlessness. And so we chase a better job, a more beautiful body, a partner who will complete us, or a sense of recognition that proves our worth. Each time we arrive for a moment, we taste sweetness. Yet the taste fades, and the promise moves forward, always one step beyond our grasp. The Buddha called this cycle dukkha. It is often translated as suffering, but the word carries a subtler weight. Dissatisfaction, unease, a restlessness woven into the fabric of life itself. It is not that joy does not exist. Joy exists, but it never stands still. It slips away, and when we try to hold it, our very act of holding becomes the source of pain. Imagine watching a child blowing soap bubbles. Each bubble floats shimmering with color, catching the light in dazzling patterns. For a moment, it is pure delight. Yet the child knows the truth: every bubble will burst. If she grasps at them, they break faster. If she simply watches, she can enjoy them for as long as they drift. Desire, when misunderstood, turns us into the grasping child. We chase, we clutch, we cry when the bubble breaks, forgetting that its very nature was always to vanish. This is where Buddhist teachings on suffering begin their radical invitation, to see reality not as cruel, but as impermanent. The Buddha did not teach this to make us despair. He taught it to free us. For once we understand impermanence, we no longer bargain with the world to give us permanence. We begin to live differently, more lightly, more gratefully, more peacefully. Number 1. The Buddha's diagnosis. Seeing the mechanism of dukkha. When the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, he was not seeking to invent a philosophy. He was seeking to understand why life, so often touched with beauty, is also so often shadowed by sorrow. What he discovered was not a curse placed on humanity, but a process unfolding in every heart. Suffering, he realized, has conditions. And if it has conditions, then by removing those conditions, it can end. Let us look closely at that process. It often begins in the smallest of moments. You spill coffee on your shirt before work. In the body, a spark of unpleasantness arises, a tightening in the chest, a flicker of heat in the face. This is not yet suffering. It is simply sensation. But then the mind leaps forward. Why me? This ruins everything. Now my day is ruined. What was once a minor discomfort becomes magnified by resistance. The mind is not content to let reality be as it is. It insists on rewriting the script. This is what the Buddha described through the chain of dependent origination. Contact gives rise to feeling. Feeling, if not met with mindfulness, gives rise to craving. Craving hardens into clinging. Clinging becomes the soil from which identity sprouts. I am unlucky, I am clumsy, my day is cursed. And suddenly, the spill of coffee is no longer about coffee. It is about the self. It becomes a heavy story with me at its center. The Buddha illustrated this dynamic with a teaching known as the 2 arrows. The first arrow is the unavoidable pain, the sharp sting of loss, the sudden startle of embarrassment, the ache of illness. The second arrow is what the mind adds: resentment, resistance, the endless replaying of what should not have been. While the first arrow cannot always be avoided, the second arrow is optional. It arises because of craving and clinging. Seeing this difference is the beginning of freedom. Think of someone losing a job. The event itself is painful. That is the first arrow. But the mind begins weaving, I am worthless. I will never recover. Everyone must think I'm a failure. Those thoughts stab again and again, each sharper than the event itself. Yet if that person can recognize, yes, this is painful, but pain is not permanent. This moment does not define my whole being. Then the second arrow falls away. The pain is real, but it does not multiply into suffering. What is striking here is the Buddha's compassion. He did not shame people for craving or clinging. He simply revealed the pattern. He held up a mirror and said, look, this is how your suffering is born. And with that mirror, he gave us choice. Once we see the machinery, we are no longer its helpless captives. The great insight of Buddha wisdom is that suffering is lawful. It follows causes and conditions. It is not punishment nor fate. It is a chain, and every chain can be broken. not by denying life, but by meeting it with awareness. To know this is to take the first step toward a peaceful life, a life where desire loosens its grip and the heart begins to breathe. Number 2, desire as the root. Why we hunger. Even when we have enough, when the Buddha declared that the origin of suffering is craving, many listeners must have felt unsettled. After all, isn't desire what drives us to grow, to love, to create? Without desire, wouldn't life be empty? Yet the Buddha's insight was not that all desire is evil, but that certain kinds of desire, rooted in ignorance and clinging, are the very engine of our suffering. Consider this. How many times have you achieved something you thought would finally bring peace, only to discover a new hunger rising almost immediately? A promotion is followed by the need for a higher title. A romantic relationship once won soon begins to carry the weight of unmet expectations. Even simple pleasures, like buying a new gadget, fade into the background within weeks, leaving us restless for the next purchase. It is as if the heart has a hole that no achievement can fill. The Buddha used a powerful metaphor to describe this state, the realm of the hungry ghosts. These beings are pictured with enormous bellies and tiny mouths, forever starving, forever unsatisfied. To modern ears, this may sound like mythology, but look closely and you will see the hungry ghost in our world today. It appears in the endless scrolling through social media, never satisfied no matter how many likes or comments we collect. It appears in the restless consumer, whose closet overflows with clothes yet who feels she has nothing to wear. It appears in the ambitious worker, whose milestones multiply, but whose heart grows emptier with each one. The tragedy is not that we desire, but that we mistake desire for the path to happiness. We imagine that by satisfying craving we will end suffering. But the Buddha saw clearly, desire does not extinguish itself through satisfaction. It feeds itself. To satisfy one craving is to plant the seed for the next. Like drinking salt water, the more we consume, the more our thirst intensifies. There is a story recorded in the suttas of a king who once asked the Buddha, "What is the greatest wealth a man can possess?" The king expected the answer to be land, gold, or power. But the Buddha replied, "Contentment is the greatest wealth." This was not a poetic exaggeration. He was pointing to a truth visible in our daily lives. The one who is content with little, who can meet each moment without demanding it be otherwise, is richer than the one who owns palaces but whose mind is restless with craving. To understand this more deeply, think of a river. If you step into a calm river, its flow supports you gently. But if the river swells into a flood, it sweeps you away. Desire is much the same. When guided by wisdom, it can carry us toward wholesome goals. The desire to learn, to practice kindness, to walk the path of awakening. But when driven by craving and clinging, desire becomes a flood. It pulls us under, leaving us gasping, convinced that only more acquisition, more control, more validation will save us. What makes this cycle so painful is that desire is fueled by a fundamental misunderstanding, the belief that impermanent things can give us permanent satisfaction. We cling to relationships as if they will never change, to youth as if it will not fade, to possessions as if they will not break or decay. The Buddha's teaching strikes at this very delusion. He reminds us that everything conditioned is impermanent. To expect permanence is to demand that fire not burn or that ice not melt. No wonder we suffer. The very fabric of reality refuses to obey our desires. Yet the recognition of impermanence is not meant to depress us. On the contrary, it can liberate us. For when we stop asking the world to give us what it cannot, lasting, unchanging joy, we free both ourselves and the world from impossible demands. A flower becomes more precious precisely because we know it will wilt. A moment with a loved one becomes more sacred because we know it cannot last forever. Desire tells us, hold tight or you will lose it. The Buddha whispers, let go and you will finally see it as it truly is. In this way, Buddhist teachings on suffering do not strip life of meaning. They return meaning to its rightful place. Instead of chasing endless satisfaction, we learn to live awake, aware, and grateful. Instead of hungering even when we have enough, we taste the quiet joy of enoughness. That joy, unlike craving, does not fade when circumstances change. It rests not on what we possess, but on how we see. Number 3, Modern mirrors, how today's world amplifies craving. If desire has always been part of the human story, then the modern age has written its loudest chapter yet. Never before have we lived in a world where craving is not only natural, but constantly cultivated, refined, and sold back to us with precision. What the Buddha saw in the villages of ancient India, the restless hunger of the mind, has now been magnified 1,000 times by technology, advertising, and the endless competition of modern life. Consider the way our devices are designed. A simple scroll, a flashing notification, a red dot on a screen, all engineered to tug at the mind's craving for novelty and validation. We think we are choosing to look, but often the looking is choosing us. The more we consume, the more restless we become. It is the hungry ghost, but now dressed in high definition, whispering in our pockets at all hours of the day. Take social media, for example. A person posts a photo hoping for connection. The likes arrive, and for a moment there is pleasure. But the pleasure fades quickly, and the mind begins to crave again. Why fewer likes than last time? Why does their photo get more attention? How can I post something better, brighter, more impressive? What began as a desire for simple connection becomes a cycle of comparison and dissatisfaction. It is not the platform itself that binds us. It is the craving it stirs and the clinging we feed. Or think about consumer culture. We are told that happiness lies just beyond the next purchase. A sleeker car, a larger house, a newer phone. And so we buy. For a week, maybe a month, the glow is real. But soon the item that once thrilled us becomes ordinary. The hunger returns and the cycle repeats. The Buddha's image of drinking salt water feels almost prophetic here. The more we drink, the thirstier we become. Even in the realm of ambition and success, craving finds fertile soil. Promotion at work feels like victory, but soon the heart whispers, what next? How much further can I climb? Students push for higher grades, athletes for faster times, artists for greater recognition. There is nothing wrong with striving, but without wisdom, striving becomes shackles. Instead of motivating us toward growth, it keeps us running on a treadmill where the finish line never arrives. This is why Buddhist teachings on suffering are so urgently relevant to modern life. They reveal that the architecture of our society often thrives on unexamined craving. Corporations profit from our restlessness. Platforms flourish by keeping us dissatisfied. Even our self-image is commodified, sold back to us in curated identities and filtered faces. The Buddha would not be surprised. He would simply point out that the same ancient law is at work. Where there is craving, there will be suffering. And yet this recognition need not leave us hopeless. Quite the opposite. For to see the mechanism clearly is to reclaim our freedom. Each time we notice the tug of comparison, the restless urge to consume, the anxiety of endless ambition, we can pause. We can breathe. We can ask, what am I really seeking here? Will this truly bring peace? Or is it just another bubble in the stream? The truth is that our modern mirrors do not create craving. They only magnify it, which means the path of release is still the same as it was under the Bodhi tree. Awareness, wisdom, and letting go. By practicing mindfulness in this noisy world, we do not withdraw from life. We learn to live in it without being swallowed by it. Like a lotus rising from muddy water, we discover that it is possible to touch the chaos without losing our clarity, to dwell in the world but not be owned by its endless hunger. Number 4, the way of release, mindfulness and the Eightfold Path. If suffering is born from craving and craving is amplified by the restless machinery of our modern world, then where does freedom lie? The Buddha's answer was as simple as it was profound. Freedom lies not in running away from life, nor in indulging it blindly, but in walking a middle path. This middle way is not a compromise between extremes. It is a radical alternative, a way of being that dissolves craving at its root. At the heart of this path is mindfulness. To live mindfully is to stop being a hostage to every desire that arises. It is to see thoughts, feelings, and cravings not as commands but as passing weather. Imagine sitting on the bank of a river, watching leaves drift by. Some are bright and beautiful. Others are dark and twisted. If you reach for each one, you tumble into the water, swept away. But if you sit quietly, Watching without grasping, the river flows on and you remain free. Mindfulness is that seat on the riverbank, the still point from which we can observe desire without drowning in. The Buddha wove mindfulness into a larger tapestry known as the Noble Eightfold Path. It begins with right view, the clear recognition that craving breeds suffering. Without this understanding, we are like a person searching for keys under the wrong lamppost. But with right view, we place our attention where the problem truly lies, and the solution begins to unfold. From there, the path flows into right intention, the quiet resolve to cultivate renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. This is not a harsh renunciation that condemns joy, but a gentle letting go of illusions. It is the difference between grasping at bubbles and admiring them as they float. Right intention is the heart whispering, "I do not need to cling to be complete." The ethical limbs of the path, right speech, right action, right livelihood, remind us that craving is not only internal, it shapes how we live with others. Words spoken in anger, actions born of greed, careers built on exploitation. These are extensions of craving into the world, and they ripple suffering outward. To walk the path is to make our lives an offering of peace rather than a factory of harm. Then come right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, the cultivation of the mind itself. Desire thrives when the mind is distracted, scattered, or intoxicated. But when the mind is trained, steadied through meditation, sharpened by attention, softened by compassion, desire loses its grip. It may arise, but it no longer commands. It is like a wild horse that, once tamed, no longer drags its rider into danger. A story from the Buddha's time illustrates this beautifully. A monk once confessed that he was tormented by desire, unable to focus on his practice. The Buddha asked him to pluck a lute string. When tightened too much, the string snapped. When left too loose, it made no sound. Only when tuned to the right tension did it produce music. In the same way, the Buddha said, discipline without balance leads to strain, and indulgence without discipline leads to aimlessness. Walk the middle path and your life will play the music of freedom. Here lies the heart of Buddha wisdom. Desire need not be destroyed with violence or repressed with shame. It can be understood, observed, and released. When we meet desire with mindfulness, it loses the power to dictate our lives. When we live ethically, craving no longer poisons our relationships. When we cultivate concentration, the mind tastes a deeper joy than any fleeting pleasure could provide. This is not theory, it is practice. And the beauty of the Eightfold Path is that it is walked step by step here and now. With every mindful breath, with every word spoken gently instead of harshly, with every moment of letting go, the knot of craving loosens. Slowly, suffering unravels. Slowly, a peaceful life emerges. Not the fragile peace that depends on circumstances, but the steady peace that flows from wisdom itself. Number 5. Living peacefully from restless. Wanting to spacious freedom when craving loosens its grip, what emerges is not emptiness but spaciousness. Many fear that letting go of desire will leave life hollow, stripped of its color. But those who have walked even a few steps along the Buddha's path discover the opposite. The world does not shrink, it expands. Life does not dull, it deepens. By no longer leaning forward into what's next, we finally taste what is. Think for a moment of sitting beneath a tree on a quiet afternoon. When the mind is restless, the scene barely registers. Thoughts of unfinished tasks, of hopes and fears, crowd out the simplicity before us. The tree is seen but not truly seen. Yet when the mind is steady, when desire no longer tugs at every passing moment, the same tree reveals itself as if for the first time. The play of light through leaves, the subtle fragrance of bark, the cool generosity of shade. Nothing has changed in the tree itself. What has changed is our capacity to be present. Freedom, then, is not found in creating a different world, but in meeting this world without the filter of craving. This is why the Buddha described nirvana not as a place but as a release, the extinguishing of the fire of greed, hatred, and delusion. The flame of desire may seem warm at first, but it burns the very hand that holds it. To put it down is not to lose warmth but to discover a deeper heat, the warmth of compassion, the light of wisdom, the glow of a mind unafraid of impermanence. Consider the story of Kisa Gotami, a young mother whose only child died suddenly. Stricken with grief, she carried the child's body from house to house, begging for medicine to restore him. When she reached the Buddha, he told her, "Bring me a mustard seed from a household that has never known death." Desperate, she searched, but every home she visited had its own story of loss. Slowly, she realized that death touches every family, that impermanence is the law of all things. In this realization, her clinging loosened. She buried her child and returned to the Buddha, not cured of sorrow in a superficial sense, but transformed by the wisdom that suffering shared is suffering lightened. The story strikes us because it shows how freedom is born not from denial, but from understanding. To live peacefully is not to erase loss, but to embrace the truth that nothing we cling to can be kept forever. And in that embrace, something miraculous happens. Compassion awakens. When we know our own suffering, we see the suffering of others more clearly. Instead of competing, comparing, or clutching, we begin to care. And caring is itself a form of freedom. In our restless world, this kind of peace can feel radical. It is not the peace sold by advertisements or promised by achievements. It is a peace that does not depend on having the perfect job, the perfect partner, or the perfect body. It is the peace of knowing that even as conditions change, even as life rises and falls, the mind can remain open, tender, and free. It is what the Buddha meant when he said that one who has let go dwells with a boundless heart, abundant, exalted, immeasurable. And so the journey that began with suffering ends not in despair, but in spacious freedom, by seeing desire for what it is, by walking the path of mindfulness and ethical living, by embracing impermanence instead of resisting it. We arrive at a life that is both lighter and fuller, a life where joy is no longer stolen by clinging, where sorrow is no longer multiplied by resistance, a life that is, in the truest sense, peaceful. Closing reflection, an invitation to a peaceful life. The Buddha's wisdom does not come to us as a command, but as an invitation. It does not demand that we renounce the world or abandon joy. Instead, it invites us to look deeply, to see how suffering is born, how desire fuels it, and how freedom becomes possible the moment we stop clinging to what cannot last. We began by exploring the shadow of suffering that lingers behind every promise of desire. We saw how craving disguises itself as a friend, offering satisfaction but delivering restlessness. We followed the Buddha's diagnosis, learning that suffering is not punishment but a process, a chain that can be observed and broken. We traced the root of desire and discovered why we hunger, even when we already have enough. We examined the mirrors of modern life, social media, consumerism, ambition, that magnify craving until it becomes the air we breathe. And we walked with the Buddha along the Eightfold Path, discovering mindfulness, ethics, and concentration as tools of release. Finally, we arrived at the heart of the matter, living peacefully, where freedom is not an escape from life but a deeper participation in it, unburdened by the weight of clinging. Now, let us pause and ask, what would it mean for you today to take even one step on this path? Perhaps it is pausing before the next purchase, asking, will this truly bring peace, or am I feeding the hungry ghost within? Perhaps it is meeting an unpleasant moment, the spilled coffee, the harsh word, with awareness refusing to let the second arrow pierce. Perhaps it is simply sitting quietly, breathing, allowing life to be as it is without insisting it be otherwise. These are not small acts, they are the seeds of freedom. The Buddha never promised a life free of change, free of loss, or free of pain. What he offered was greater, the ability to meet change with wisdom, to meet loss with compassion, and to meet pain without multiplying it with resistance. This is the essence of a peaceful life, the treasure hidden in plain sight. As you leave this teaching, remember, desire will continue to whisper. It will promise happiness in the next possession, the next success, the next affirmation. But you have heard another voice now, the quiet voice of Buddha wisdom, reminding you that the peace you seek is already here, waiting in the stillness of a heart that lets go. May you walk gently on this path. May you discover freedom not by reaching further, but by resting deeply in what is. And may your journey bring not only peace to yourself, but compassion and light to all beings you meet. This is the invitation of the Dharma. This is the gift of the Buddha's teachings on suffering. And this is the promise of a life unshackled from restless desire, a life that is truly, beautifully free.